But Saddam Hussein and Iraq were not involved in 9/11,
no,
right?
But they tried to make it seem like they were. See, that's part of the lie, really insidious, the lengths that they went to try to implicate Saddam Hussein in 9/11. And one of the things that I found really disturbing is that, you know, they sent our troops to war in Afghanistan. And you know, to many Americans, that was acceptable. That was a good war because, after all, Osama bin Laden, the purported mastermind of 9/11, was hiding out in Afghanistan. So, okay, so it's okay to send our troops into Afghanistan. Congress was convinced. But what happened shortly afterwards, and that was in like the fall of 2001, is that they started rounding up massive numbers of people, both on the battleground, but just anywhere. I mean, the United States CIA put out a message that anyone who thinks that their neighbor or some person might be implicated in 9/11, you know, turn the guy in and you'll be paid money. So that's what happened. So
if you don't like your neighbor and you want to make some money.
You want to make some money, hey, turn him in. Say he's linked to 9/11. And then what happened is that you know, thousands of prisoners were captured in the early months of the war in Afghanistan. The whole question was, well, what do we do with them? And where do we put them? And how do we question them? And so there you get you and Bybee working away on their memos. And what did they do? They sort of systematically, first of all, they said that these guys don't have the normal protections of prisoners under the Geneva Conventions. And one of those normal protections is that you can't mistreat prisoners. So they come up with these legal explanations to say that if prisoners connected with Al-Qaeda or the Taliban, if they're picked up, they're called enemy combatants. They're not prisoners, and they should not be treated as prisoners of war, and therefore they can be tortured. And they just concocted these legal memos out of whole cloth, completely ignoring international law and also even the U.S. criminal code against torture. And what was the reason? And this is one thing we found out subsequently. I say we, journalists, a lot of good journalists and lawyers. What we found out is that the early waterboarding that happened, you know, which is blatantly illegal. It's one of the most severe forms of torture that they did in 2002 and early 2003 in the months leading up to the war in Iraq. Why did they torture these people so severely? Like Khalil Sheikh Mohammed 183 times during March alone, 03. Why? They wanted not to get what's called actionable intelligence. What they wanted to get was false confessions. They wanted to get these detainees to say, "Yeah, I knew Osama bin Laden, or I worked with Al Qaeda, or I had links." The main thing they wanted was to get links to Saddam Hussein, because then, if they could link them to Saddam Hussein, then they would get confessions that Saddam Hussein was somehow behind 9/11. And once you got that, bingo, you got a case for war.
Is that where they got the non-existent weapons of mass destruction?
Yeah, they got that. They got, well, I think they actually, yeah, I think they got some confessions. But the main thing with that, frankly, is through, sadly, the media. In fact, the New York Times. So here's the other story that most Americans don't hear. The real case for regime change, getting rid of Saddam Hussein, was that Saddam Hussein was an opponent of Israel and would never agree to sell oil or pipe oil through a pipeline to Israel. And Israel, during all of this period, had great ambitions of developing its energy section and to revive that pipeline that had been built after World War I that I talked about earlier in the show, connecting Iraq with Haifa, the port of Haifa, which has a major refinery there. In fact, it was used heavily during World War II to fuel up the Allies' navy. So that had fallen into disuse since 1948, the War of Independence for Israel. And Benjamin Netanyahu at the time, he was not prime minister. I think he was finance minister. He was bragging about how right after the invasion of Iraq, the oil was going to start flowing back to Haifa. And the whole point was just to get rid of Hussein. And who would they have? The person they wanted to put in place was an Iraqi exile leader named Ahmed Shalabi, who was living outside of the Iraq. The plan was bring him back in. He was brought back in. He was made oil minister for a while. He was totally in favor of selling oil to Israel and shipping it via pipeline. But the problem was he was also so willing to do this that he is the main guy that made up the weapons of mass destruction and then fed his false information to Judith Miller, a reporter for the New York Times. And so I would say that during the period of leading up to the war, there's Judith Miller cranking out these stories about weapons of mass destruction using Chalabi as her source, and it was all false. And eventually it was found out, so Chalabi was discredited. Miller was let go. But by then, the damage had already been done, and the U.S. troops were in there.